Arrays are one of the simplest and most common data structures in all of programming, and JavaScript is no different in this regard. Arrays are like a series of boxes strung together, where each box has a number and contains a value. In JavaScript, you introduce arrays by using square brackets. So in this first line, primes is the name of the variable, and its value is an array, a series of boxes, and each box contains a number, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, and so forth. In the second example, names is the array, and it contains a series of boxes where each box contains a string. Note that you put commas between the array elements, but you don't put a comma at the end after the last array element. Okay, so the idea of arrays is pretty simple. The only confusing part to beginners is that the first element in the array is not entry number 1, but it's entry number 0. This is actually a common convention, and most modern programming languages follow this convention, but nevertheless it's kind of confusing to programmers, and people argue about whether that was the right approach, but nevertheless we're kind of stuck with it now, and it's a common convention. And so the first entry is 0, and so the last entry is the length minus 1. So primes has 6 things, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, and 13. The first entry is entry 0. The last entry is entry 5. 6 in total, but they're numbered 0 to 5, not 1 to 6. And same thing for the entries that are strings. The first one is entry 0. The last one, since there are 4 elements, is entry 3. And I want to point out that you can reassign to arrays. Once you have an array, you can say reset the element number 3, which is really the 4th element, to Jill. And then if I look up the 3rd element again later, it is in fact Jill. Another useful thing about arrays, at least in JavaScript, is that you can ask an array how big it is. Once you allocate an array, or if someone passes an array to the function, you don't know how big it is, you can ask it how big it is by looking up the length property. You use the main variable name dot length, no parentheses. It's not a function call. It's a property. It's a field. Notice that if the length is 4, that means the indexes run from 0 to 3. 4 entries in total, running from 0 to the length minus 1. Okay, once you have an array, you might want to loop down the array and do something on each of the elements. And so the most common way, and the way that is similar to many other modern programming languages, including Java, C# and C++, is to use a for loop where you first initialize a variable to be 0, because that's the first index. Then you, in your test that's checked each time around the loop, you check if the index is less than the length. Not less than or equal to, less than, strictly less than. And then each time after you finish the loop, you update the index by 1. So the first time around the loop, I is 0. So this gives you the first entry in the array. The next time around the loop, I is 1. So that gives you the second entry in the array, and so forth. And then you do something with the array element. You add them up. You clear out the text fields if they're text fields. You process the strings in some way, but looping down gives you each element in turn, and then you process it somehow. Okay, that's the most common way in JavaScript, and it's similar to the way you do it in other languages. But there is a slightly shorter way that advanced JavaScript programmers use quite frequently, and I call it the Lindsay loop because my daughter Lindsay, who is a JavaScript developer at Google, pointed out to me and said that many of the advanced JavaScript programmers at Google use this loop routinely because it's slightly shorter, and for experienced Java developers, it's not any more confusing. But for beginners, it's a little more confusing, so you probably want to use the top way. But let me just summarize the bottom way. So remember that a for loop has 3 parts, each separated by a semicolon. So the first part introduces 2 variables, I, and it sets the value to 0, and value, and it doesn't give it an initial value. So the 2 variables are I and value. I has an initial value of 0. Value has no initial value. Then the test that's checked each time before you go around the loop, it says assign entry I of the array to value. Now that's a little confusing. How is it ever going to stop? And the trick here relies on what we talked about when we discussed conditionals. we said that normally when you have an if statement or you check a condition, it's really a Boolean value, x is less than 4. But JavaScript is actually more liberal, and there's a number of things that are considered false. False is false, 0 is false, undefined is false, null is false, 0 is false, an empty string is false, and not a number is false. Well, in this case, if you look up an array and you ask for an entry that doesn't exist, its value is undefined, which is false. So this test in the middle will fail when it gets to the point that I is no longer a real entry in the array. And since it will fail, it returns something that is treated by JavaScript as false, the loop will just stop. So this is a slightly shorter way. You don't have to separately check the length and then look up the value. You can just look up the value and it will automatically stop when it gets to the end. So although this loop is shorter and more convenient for advanced JavaScript programmers, it's a little more confusing for beginning JavaScript programmers. So I recommend that you start with the top one. This is particularly true if you've done any programming in similar languages like C, C++, C#, or Java, because you're already familiar with the top version. All right, that's the most common way to loop down arrays, but there's a warning of some way not to loop down arrays. And so many other programming languages have a construct where you can set up a temporary variable, and that variable is assigned to each element of the array in turn. So people who come from other programming languages say, aha, JavaScript has something like that. It has for in. It must work the same way, but it doesn't. So really the only reason I'm mentioning this is to say this is not the way to loop down arrays in JavaScript. Because when you do that, this variable that you introduce is not the individual values in the array. It's the indexes in the array. So in the top loop, I is 0 the first time around, not the first array entry, then it's 1 and so forth. First of all, that's inconvenient. It's not really any simpler than the normal style for loop. And secondly, we'll see later that JavaScript has things that kind of look like arrays. They have numeric indexes, but they also have some additional properties. And if you use the for in loop, it'll pick up the additional properties as well, and your loop will probably give the wrong answer. So save the for in loop for when we get to objects and you want to loop over the properties, the field names of the objects. Don't use the for in loop to loop down arrays. Okay, so the first thing we did is we said, here's a variable, and here are the array values separated by commas inside square brackets. But sometimes you don't know ahead of time how big the array is. You do some computation and say, oh, this is how many people I have in my department. Let me allocate an array that big. But you don't know how many people are in the department until runtime when you do a calculation. So you can't use the simple approach where you just put square brackets and you list the array values separated by commas inside. So instead, you first build an empty array of a certain size, then you loop down and you fill in the elements. And so a simplified version of this is I say, all right, I'm going to make names, and it's going to be a 4-element array. And then I go and I fill in the individual entries with specific values. That kind of gives you the gist of it. But you wouldn't normally list out the values separately and explicitly, and instead you would loop down them because you don't know how big the array is ahead of time. So you say new array, but probably you don't really say 4. You say X, where X is the result of some calculation, how many entries are in the department. And then you loop down the array from I equals 0 to, now you're tempted to say 4 here. You know the array is 4. But don't say 4 here. Say the array name dot length, which happens to be equal to 4. The reason for this is, suppose you put a 4 here and a 4 here. You'd get the right answer. But then later on, you go back and you say, oh, wait, I don't want an array that's size 4. I want an array that's size 7. But you still have a 4 here, and you might forget to update it. So instead, calculate the size of the array, and then look up the length of the array so that if you change the size of the array above, you automatically get the right answer in the loop. Okay, a few more things that you can do with arrays. Arrays in JavaScript are a little bit different than in most other programming languages in that you don't have to have all the entries in between the first entry and the last entry. So look at this example. I make a new array, but I don't say the size. Then I can just start adding random entries. And so I have an entry 0. I have this big, huge, giant entry, 100,000. But I don't have anything in between. And JavaScript does not make an entry 1, an entry 2, an entry 3, an entry 999,999, and so forth, and then an entry 100,000. It only has 2 entries. So it's not a long series of contiguous boxes like in most languages. It's more like a hash map. And a hash map means a value that corresponds to a key. So I have a key 0. At entry 0, you have Joe, and entry 100,000, you have Juan. Now, this whole idea of hash maps and contiguous entries is not really all that important for beginners, but the main point here is that in JavaScript, usually you allocate a whole bunch of entries with consecutive numbers, but you don't have to. And you can have individual numbers and have no values in between. JavaScript doesn't allocate anything in between. There's not like empty boxes. It just allocates 2 entries. Okay, so that seems pretty natural to JavaScript programmers who start off in JavaScript, but it seems very unusual to programmers who come from most other programming languages. Another thing that seems natural to JavaScript programmers, but unusual to people from other programming languages, is that you can change the length. You can take the length variable and assign it to something else. And you can assign to an array entry even if it's bigger than the length, and then the length will automatically be updated. And in addition, there's this method called push, which sticks something on the end of the array and increases the length by 1. And any of these operations can be done no matter how you made the array, whether you did the one-step process where you used square brackets and separated the entries by commas, or you said new array and it stuck the values in later. Arrays have methods in JavaScript. Once you have an array, you can take the array variable, put a dot, put a function name, and perhaps some arguments, and do some things. And we'll see some examples in the upcoming slides. And finally, when we get to objects later, we'll see that objects can also be sort of treated like arrays. In other words, you can have a person object with a first name and a last name, but that object can also have some properties that are just numbers, entry 0, entry 1, entry 2, and entry 3. And even though you kind of think of it as a person object, you can loop down it like an array. And a lot of the JavaScript libraries, jQuery is the most important one, but Prototype and EXTJS and several others use this idea extensively.